Have you ever watched someone you love get humiliated, just because they looked old? Have you ever clenched your jaw, wishing the world still knew what dignity looked like? It started with a stop sign and two patrol lights flickering in the heat. A battered pickup truck, crawling down Route 17, groaning like it was too proud to quit. Inside, a man. Alone. 84 years old. Weathered hands at 10 and 2. Eyes straight ahead. They didn't see a father. Or a soldier. Or the man who built half the wheelchair ramps in this town. They saw rust. And silence. And someone they didn't need to respect. One officer laughed as he circled the truck. Looks like it drove straight out of a junkyard. The other stepped closer, his tone sharp. You got a license, old man? Or just a long story? Frank Delaney didn't move. Didn't flinch. The heat was rising, and so was the weight in his chest. Not from fear, but from something worse. He'd worn a uniform longer than either of those boys had been alive. He'd buried friends who never made it home. He'd come back, quietly, and served every day since, without medals, without thanks. And now he was being treated like a nobody. But Frank knew something they didn't. Respect doesn't rust. And sometimes, the world has to be reminded. The hard way. Frank Delaney had lived in the same small town for over 60 years. The kind of place where folks wave at you whether they know your name or not. And most did know Frank, at least by sight. They'd seen him at the hardware store, his back a little bent, his pace slow but steady, always hauling something heavier than he should have been lifting alone. He drove a 1966 Ford F-100 with chipped paint the color of dried clay. The muffler groaned with age. The windshield had a single crack like a scar across its surface. But the engine, he kept that part alive. Like everything else he cared for, it was maintained with quiet discipline. Frank wasn't the kind of man who said much. He nodded more than he spoke. And when he did speak, it came out firm, with that gravel and smoke kind of voice that only came from years of wind, war, and not wasting words. That morning, he'd picked up a bundle of wood planks and a bag of concrete mix. The kind that made your knees creak just thinking about it. He didn't buy it for himself. A neighbor down the street, Miss Clara, had slipped last week. Her porch steps were rotted through. Frank promised her a ramp before Sunday. She tried to pay him. He told her not to insult him. Now he sat behind the wheel, arms still, eyes calm, heart somewhere between memory and muscle. When the officers approached, he didn't argue. He didn't protest. He just rolled down the window and said quietly, "Morning." They didn't say it back. One leaned in and sniffed. The other tapped the hood again. "You always drive this heap around town?" Frank glanced up, just once. His voice didn't rise. "Long as she gets me where I need to go." Then he placed both hands back on the wheel and waited. Like a man who's been taught not to move unless there's good reason. The officer on the driver's side took a step back and crossed his arms. The younger one, maybe mid-20s, leaned down toward the window again. "License and registration," he said, voice sharp. "Let's go." Frank reached slowly into his shirt pocket, pulled out a small worn leather wallet, and passed over his license. Then he pointed toward the glove box. "It's in there. Registration cards under the manual." The officer gave a small grunt. "Step out of the vehicle, sir. We'll get it ourselves." Frank didn't argue. He opened the door and stepped out, his boots making a dry thud on the shoulder gravel. The heat hit harder once he was outside. He kept his hands visible, palms down at his sides, like he'd done it 100 times before. Maybe he had. They had him walk to the back of the truck. One of them muttered something into his radio. The other opened the glove box and began pulling things out with gloved hands: old receipts, a folded state map, a pair of reading glasses in a case with duct tape around the hinge. Then came the questions. "Where you headed?" "Just home." "From where?" "Lumber yard on 8th. "What for?" "Helping a neighbor." The younger deputy raised an eyebrow. "You always drive this thing around?" "No plates on the rear. Nothing valid up front." Frank looked at the bumper. The historic vehicle tag had peeled from the corner in the heat. Barely legible unless you were looking for it. "It's registered." "Has been for years." "We'll see about that," the older officer said. They asked him to empty his pockets. He did. Keys. A folded grocery list. A pocket knife. A Polaroid photo of a woman and a young boy in front of a wood-paneled house. A small notebook, rubber-banded, pages bent at the corners. "What's this?" the young officer asked, flipping through it. "Names," Frank answered. The officer frowned. "Of who?" Frank didn't blink. "People I've worked with. Helped. Buried." The notebook was handed back without care. The officer shook his head. "This truck's not road legal. Unsafe equipment. Improper display. You might be pushing $1,000 in fines, sir." Frank said nothing. Not out of guilt. Not out of fear. Just a silence that came from long experience, of knowing when words wouldn't be heard. The two deputies stepped aside, muttering. One laughed. "Might have ourselves a moonshiner." The other replied, low and careless. "Or just another lonely old man with too much time and not enough sense." Frank stood beside his truck, the sun high and sharp over his shoulder, and waited. Frank was told to sit on the curb. The pavement burned through the denim of his jeans, but he didn't shift. He placed his palms flat on his thighs, fingers curled slightly, and stared out toward the tree line across the road. No shade. No wind. Just the quiet hum of summer insects and the occasional snap of a distant screen door. One of the officers leaned against the hood of the patrol car, sipping coffee from a paper cup. The younger one paced, restless. He glanced at Frank, then at his partner. "He's not being cooperative." The older deputy shrugged. "Let's call it in. Unregistered vehicle, elderly male, unresponsive. Might be a risk." A few cars passed, slowing slightly to glance. One man rolled down his window and pointed his phone at Frank. A woman across the street frowned, then looked away. No one stopped. The younger officer bent down and looked at Frank again. "You on any medication, sir? Any memory issues? Maybe some confusion?" Frank didn't answer. Not because he hadn't heard. Because there was nothing worth saying. A few feet away, a clerk from the gas station had stepped out. Mike Watkins. Mid-60s. Wore an old navy cap and squinted into the sunlight. When he saw who was sitting on the curb, his face changed. He didn't shout. He didn't wave. He went back inside and picked up the phone. Down the block, an elderly woman stepped off the sidewalk and called across the street. "Excuse me, officers, that man's name is Frank Delaney. He helps fix up homes around here. He's not a threat." "Ma'am, please return to your vehicle," the older deputy said, without looking at her. "But he's a good man," she insisted. "He's done more for this town than." "We're handling it," the younger one snapped. "Please stand back." The woman hesitated, then turned away. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her purse strap and walked on. Frank remained still. His knees ached. His throat was dry. But he didn't show it. Dignity doesn't yell. It doesn't demand. It waits. And sometimes, it suffers in silence. At 8:07 a.m., the wind shifted. The heat still hung thick over Route 17, but something about the air felt heavier. Down the street, a black SUV turned the corner with government plates and windows tinted dark enough to make people pause. It didn't slow to look around. It knew exactly where it was going. The SUV pulled up behind the patrol car. Not fast. Not loud. Just certain. The younger deputy lowered his coffee. "Federal," he mumbled, eyes narrowing. The older one adjusted his belt, unsure. "Maybe." The SUV engine cut off. For a long second, no one moved. Then the rear door opened. A tall man stepped out, his dress uniform sharp and decorated, for stars across his shoulder boards, and a face that didn't smile. He didn't need to. General Michael Abrams. He closed the door behind him and walked with the weight of someone who had stood at graves and briefed presidents. His eyes locked on Frank Delaney. He didn't look at the officers. Not at first. "Which of you stopped this man?" the general asked. Neither deputy answered. "Sergeant First Class Frank Delaney." "Which of you detained him?" They exchanged glances. The younger officer finally spoke. "We didn't know who he was, sir." Abrams didn't blink. "You didn't ask." He stepped forward. Quiet steps. Steady. He stopped a few feet from Frank, who was still sitting calmly on the curb, hands resting on his knees. "Permission to assist you to your feet, Sergeant?" the general asked. Frank looked up. Nodded. "Granted." He rose slowly. No help. Just strength in worn knees and will. The crowd across the street had grown. Phones were up now. Silence filled the space where traffic once buzzed. A boy tugged at his father's shirt. "Is he famous?" His father didn't look away. "No. He's more important than that." General Abrams turned to the officers. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "This man taught me how to lead." Fort Benning. 1983. He saved 3 of us during a training disaster. Carried one out himself. Then he stayed behind to train 2 more generations. The younger officer swallowed hard. "You profiled him. You dismissed him. You humiliated him." The older deputy tried to speak. "Sir, we were just following." "Don't," Abrams said, his voice like steel under velvet. "You called him uncooperative. You joked about him being confused. You never once asked his name. You saw an old truck and an older man. And you thought that was the whole story." Frank stood beside the general. Silent, but taller than he'd been 10 minutes before. The younger officer removed his sunglasses, eyes low. "I'm sorry, sir." Frank looked at him. "Don't apologize to me," he said, voice quiet but sure. "Apologize to the next man before you decide he's nobody." And for the first time since sunrise, nobody said a word. General Abrams turned to his aide, who had been standing quietly near the SUV, holding a leather-bound portfolio. The aide stepped forward and handed it over with both hands. The general opened it carefully, revealing a single document on top. "This is the unclassified service summary of Sergeant First Class Frank Delaney," he said. "I suggest you both read it." The older officer took it with hesitation, his hands suddenly unsure. Abrams didn't look at him again. His voice, steady and low, carried across the growing crowd. This man has 3 Bronze Stars. He led 2 recovery teams after Hurricane Hugo in '89. He ran emergency communications during the blackout in Ohio when no one else could get a signal out. He built temporary shelters in Kentucky during the flood of '97, without being asked, without a paycheck. He paused, letting the weight settle. And last year, he built and delivered 22 access ramps for disabled veterans in this very county. Materials paid for out of his own pocket. A nurse in scrubs stepped forward from the crowd. She was holding her phone, but her eyes never left Frank. He donates blood. Every month. Like clockwork, she said. My clinic has his name framed on the wall. 30 years of it. An older man raised a cane, his voice cracking. He fixed my heating last winter, he said. Didn't charge me a cent, left a sack of groceries by the door, too. Never told me who it was. The stories came in pieces, quiet, from different corners of the street. A teenager whispered that Frank had taught her scout troop how to tie rescue knots. A mechanic pointed out that Frank once helped rebuild his dad's garage after a fire. None of it had ever been written down. None of it ever asked for credit. Frank stood there, arms at his sides. Still silent. But something in the way he breathed, measured, calm, steady, said more than words could. General Abrams turned back toward him. I owe my life to you, he said softly. And I've never forgotten. Frank nodded once. Not out of pride. Just acknowledgement. The kind that passes between men who have seen more than they can explain. The younger officer swallowed hard and looked up from the file. I had no idea. That's the point, Frank said. You never know. He didn't say it with anger. He said it like someone who had watched the world forget too many good men, and had grown tired of watching it happen again. The general stood tall beside Frank, but his voice softened. This truck, he said, gesturing to the rusted Ford behind them, has seen more service than most men ever will. It's registered as a historical vehicle with the Department of Defense. The paperwork's filed annually. You just didn't look deep enough. The younger officer shifted his weight, staring at the ground. The older one adjusted his hat, lips pressed tight. Frank looked at them both. His voice, when it came, was quiet but even. They were doing their job, the way they understood it. General Abrams turned slightly, surprised. You're letting them off easy. No, Frank said. I'm holding the system accountable. Not just the people in it. He paused, then added, we've built a world where the badge speaks louder than the man. I've seen it before. Too many times. Across the street, someone clapped once. Then another. The sound caught on the breeze, hesitant at first, but growing. It wasn't a cheer. It was recognition. The sheriff arrived minutes later, called in by someone who had seen the video already posted online. He spoke quietly with the general, nodded solemnly to Frank, and asked the deputies to stand down. No more tickets were written. By the end of the hour, someone had placed a small American flag beside Frank's truck. Frank didn't smile. He didn't pose for pictures. He simply walked around the side, opened the driver's door, and sat down with care. As the engine turned over and the truck pulled away, no one said a word. But every head bowed slightly as he passed. The video of that morning spread fast. By nightfall, it had been viewed over 3 million times. The headline read simply, "Decorated veteran humiliated until a general stepped in." By the end of the week, the mayor had issued a formal apology. June 8 was declared Frank Delaney Day. A local hardware chain offered to fund any project Frank wanted. He declined, but suggested they donate lumber instead. Within days, ramp requests from veterans across the county doubled. The sheriff's department launched a new training protocol, recognizing quiet service. Every deputy now received a file with Frank's story on their first day. But not all change came from policy. The younger deputy from that morning, Officer Keller, showed up at the VFW hall the following Saturday. He didn't speak at first. Just watched. Helped stack chairs. Cleaned the coffee urn. Frank saw him, gave a small nod, and went back to sweeping the back steps. A few weeks later, Keller asked if he could help build the next ramp. Frank didn't answer right away. Just handed him a pair of work gloves and pointed to the wood. They worked side by side in silence. And sometimes, that's how change begins, not with headlines or handshakes, but with one person doing better after knowing better. Frank never changed much. He still drove the old truck. Still worked with his hands. Still walked into each project like it was just something that needed doing. But now, when people saw him on the street, they didn't just wave. They stood a little straighter. And they saw him. Really saw him. Sometimes, the most powerful legacies aren't carved in stone or echoed through speeches, they're built quietly, one act of service at a time. Frank Delaney never asked for recognition. He didn't wear his medals or talk about what he'd done. But when the world forgot who he was, his dignity reminded them. The officers who once saw only rust and age learned to look deeper. And one of them, Officer Keller, chose not to walk away in shame, but to return, rebuild, and become part of something better. This story isn't just about one man. It's about all the quiet heroes around us, those who serve without applause, who show up without being asked, and who still believe that respect is earned through action, not appearance. How many Franks do we pass by each day without knowing the roads they've walked? If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life who served quietly and gave everything without asking for a thing, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories. Because stories like Frank's deserve to be remembered and shared.